This episode I'm joined by Christian Roa, who is an independent scholar and the translator of Bernard Charbonneau's The Green Light, a self-critique of the ecological movement. In this episode we discuss the work of Bernard Charbonneau, ecology, freedom, modernity, technology, and more. I'd like to thank my paid subscribers and patrons for making all of this work possible, and if you'd like to support Hermitix or become part of the community, please find links in the description below. Enjoy. Christian Roa, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Yes, thank you.
We are going to be discussing, I originally emailed you because I saw you on a podcast speaking about Jacques Ellul. And I emailed you about the work of Ellul, and you said to me that because this podcast is dealing with underappreciated thinkers, that I should really do an episode on the work of Bernard Charbonneau, who we're going to be talking about today, who directly influenced Ellul, but is just entirely overlooked, to the point where I'd never even heard of his name, and never even seen a footnote or anything to do with Charbonneau. So this is probably one of the few appearances of this thinker on YouTube or anywhere. So it'll be an introduction to his work, which is largely inaccessible in English. There is the one translated book on his thought about ecological awareness.
That I personally translated.
The Green Lantern.
Yeah, the Green Light.
The Green Light. Oh man, I'm really sorry. The Green Light, translated by itself. So before we jump in on the work of Charbonneau, just tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and why does the work of Charbonneau interest you so much?
I'm an independent scholar, but I define myself as a historian, and I have a certain reputation as an intellectual historian, though I never really had a position. You know, it happened like that, but that leaves me free to investigate whoever I want. You know, so I began to discover then Charbonneau. During my PhD thesis, but maybe I should, before I get into that, get more of a general view of what I do, what my interests are. So being an independent scholar, I support myself as a translator from several languages, like from German, and I've translated Carl Schmitt, Paul Tillich, for instance. Also, I'm also an art critic, a film critic, but my focus is on digging up these major thinkers that have somehow fallen, that have not been somehow missed their chance to enter the canon, and therefore are considered most by academia as non-existent or at best suspect. In that category, Bernard Charbonneau is a prime candidate. In terms of my own publications, the main one I would say is completely unrelated to my main interest. It's traditional festivals, a multicultural encyclopedia, a reference work that's available in a great many public and academic libraries, because I do have this. It's as though I was at once. I have a large scale focus on practically world history, but that's sort of in the background most of the time. My research deals mostly with the nitty-gritty of intellectual history, how certain figures develop their thought, interacted, etc. So it's part of the same territory as philosophy, except it's often with people who don't necessarily think of themselves as philosophers, just as thinkers, human beings who think about the world they're in, and the implications of that, including the social implications. Therefore, out of the box, and you are very often out of academia even. So these are the tens of figures I tend to focus on. So when I was still in academia, then what happened is I was about to do, the way I discovered Charbonneau was that a few days before crossing the Atlantic to do my field work for my PhD thesis on the origins of French personalism, an expert in those kinds of third way movements in interwar France, happened to be invited to my thesis director's seminar, and I was entrusted with bringing him back to the subway. And just before we parted, he almost whispered in my ears a tip about what I might want to look up in my research. Is that did you know that Jacques Ellul was part of the personalist movement, and that didn't fall on deaf ears, because I'd come across the name of Jacques Ellul through my own interest in George Grant, a Canadian philosopher of technique, and therefore my two interests interconnected. Then there was a specific then personalist approach to the philosophy of technique, and I was determined to dig that up. So when I was based in France, then that would have been in 1888, I started touring the survivors of these movements of the 1930s and digging up archives. But Ellul was still very much alive, and in the meantime, I discovered that he had a partner in these pre-war enterprises, Bernard Charbonneau, who also published books, but they were very few and far between. They mostly didn't find publishers, and one had just come out. Maybe is Charbonneau's book on the state was written in 1949, was finally published in that year, 1988, because he described the state as a structural phenomenon tending to totalitarianism, but independently of ideology. See, and he had this epic description of it. That was quite sweeping, and it really blew me away when I discovered it. I was intent on also meeting him, but it was difficult because I discovered that he was, especially in the summer, living almost off the grid. So it's Ellul, when I finally met him in Bordeaux, who gave me sort of instructions on how to try to find him way out in the Béarn countryside. So I was left by the bus at a crossroad. Had to walk 10 kilometers to the edge of a village before I finally found Charbonneau, and we instantly clicked because I guess probably because of a sweeping view of history that he has. Both he and Charbonneau and Ellul are historians, but he's more of a geographer. And so I became rather close to him, and I've visited him several times, and then his widow for another 8 years. After 8 years, him, and 8 years when he was alone, we used to say with his widow that it was a three-way dialogue, because he had this kind of symbiotic relationship with his wife. So that the thought was still alive, for a decade or two. And I've delved into it, found the original documents from the 30s, including, if you can imagine, in his dusty attic, there was these flimsy newsletters from these documents that I realized, for instance, that his manifesto of 1937 about feeling for nature as a revolutionary force. Well, I said, my God, the Green Movement starts right here in this flimsy piece of paper disintegrating under my hands. See, so I copied a lot of that material, and my first scholarly article was devoted to Jacques Ellul and Bernard Charbonneau and their autonomous strand of French personalism as the first, as the original form of political ecology, and also a very early form of the critique of technique. So the point is that's something that's associated, has been discovered largely through Ellul's book, The Technological Society, published in France in 1954, and then finding much more of a reception in English-speaking world from the 1964. But actually, this was just a kind of belated sort of systematization of something they had both been thinking about since around 1930. And actually, Jacques Ellul was the first to point to that, though his disciples were not very keen to take that up. But the key insights about the centrality of technique in accounting for modern phenomena, the dynamics of contemporary society, Ellul actually borrowed. It was Charbonneau's idea, and he delegated it to write it down to Ellul while he concentrated on the state. See, so when you think about Ellul and how original he is in his approach to society, well, the gist of that, it's Charbonneau who actually discovered that on his own. See, so Ellul got lucky in getting to develop that, having a foothold in academia, etc. And Charbonneau was even that was marginal to the mainstream. But even more marginal was Charbonneau would have these kinds of breaks of these kinds of footholds, and he remained, he preferred to stay close to nature as a normal school teacher near the Pyrenees, so he could think and fish and so by shunning or the normal academic path or intellectual path centered on Paris, he ceased to exist socially. So that's there's an element of media dynamics there, and how society works, and how the ideas and insights that really question it, they won't even be discussed. If they can't pin down and put you on a spectrum of the political debates as they are framed, you will not even exist. And that's the story of Charbonneau's life. Basically, he wrote almost as many works as Ellul, but most of them never found publishers until very late in his life or until after his death. And they anticipated many of our current issues even before mid-century. From the 1930s, the basics were there. So I discovered that basically in these obscure newsletters in his attic, way out in the French countryside. So that's the journey I had with Charbonneau. So I've been championing a kind of an awareness of him as the idea, first of all, of Ellul and Charbonneau as a tandem, that is finally getting recognized. The Ellul associations, both French-speaking, English-speaking, their events more and more are Ellul-Charbonneau events, not just Ellul events. It's being recognized by the Ellul community. As Ellul has always maintained, don't look at me alone. You can't understand me if you're not aware of Charbonneau. Aside from him originating, this impulse, this kind of approach to the understanding of society, and that's making inroads. Also, Charbonneau. That book that you mentioned that I translated, it was conceived as a self-criticism of the French ecological movement after just a decade of existence in 1980. But he built on his whole experience since the 1930s to put that in perspective. And so even with a 50 year delay, even on that scene, he was somewhat recognized as a pioneer. Even if you cut out the first 50 years where he was completely invisible, even on that scene, he was kind of something of an elder statesman. And after his death, his writings have been rediscovered and canonized in a way by the degrowth movement, if you know what that is. So in at least in the continental degrowth movement, he's becoming a household name. So that's how you might situate him right now.
Okay. There is a lot there, and I think a lot of that will come back in. Potentially your relationship with Charbonneau, what he was like as a person, and his sort of personal exit to to rural France and getting away from the city. I think that's an interesting idea. But I'd like to get the Hermitix question out at the start. Yeah. So, as we're talking about a specific philosopher, thinker, theorist, Bernard Charbonneau, we can put him in the room, and you can place 3 thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Who would you pick?
With or without Charbonneau?
With
Charbonneau.
Sorry?
Is that independently of Charbonneau? Because I'd answer the question without thinking of Charbonneau, see?
Oh, okay, yeah.
I'm sure you'd be interested in that conversation, But the people I had put in the room were, well, yes, I might mention, of course, you discovered me through a video with Jonathan Pajot, where we discussed 3 thinkers, Ellul, Charbonneau, and McLuhan, Marshall McLuhan, who, along with George Grant, is a great Canadian thinker of technique. And of course, I did not mention probably that I'm Canadian. I did my PhD at McGill University in Montreal, and I'm still based in Montreal. So I have perhaps something of a Canadian angle to to my intellectual life. That so it's when the Canadian angle and the European and the French angle sort of connected that was the spark that because I'd become aware of this issue of technique through Canadian thinkers. So yes. So McLuhan is of course someone that I would put in that room, and I would put him in conversation with Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy, who's also a fascinating, also multidisciplinary thinker, who's also obscured and made unknown by the other half of his intellectual tandem with Franz Rosenzweig, but which you may have heard in terms of as an existential thinker. Rosenstock-Huessy is also getting more appreciated, and it's particularly. And also the third person I would put there is Jean Gebser, another transdisciplinary thinker, and all these 3, they cover this same kinds of sweeping world historical territories in terms of the dynamics of culture as it's influenced by things like media and speech acts and grammar and perspective, and the perhaps less not only the content of ideas, but also the medium of culture. See, and how that develops in a kind of fourfold pattern, which they all kind of have in some way over time, and especially in our time. And unfortunately, actually, I've discovered just recently that this virtual conversation already exists in a way in a blog I just come across called the Chrysalis by someone called Scott Preston, I think in Alberta, who does connect these dots between precisely those thinkers, McLuhan, Rosenstock-Huessy, Gebser, and I guess and others like Carl Jung and David Bohm, etc. So that's sort of where I am today, and Charbonneau and Ellul are sort of an element of that configuration for me. But of course they're thinking more dialectical, I suppose, as opposed to the kind of fourfold integrative approach that these other thinkers have. But anyway, they're the ones on my plate right now. So I guess we could proceed with Charbonneau. Yeah.
Okay. Just one quick question as a Canadian. Have you come across the work of Anthony Wilden before?
No, actually, no.
So he was a Canadian theorist who was also cross-disciplinary, a game theorist, philosopher, psychoanalysis, and mixing a lot of things. But he's extremely also an extremely underappreciated thinker. So maybe there's something about underappreciated thinkers and Canadians. Who knows? McLuhan never really gets the attention I think he deserves either. So I think there might be something there.
Yeah.
So to begin with Charbonneau though, I think, just to begin with a really, really big question, and I understand this is really open, but in what way does Charbonneau's critique of the ecological movement and his criticisms of how we are ecologically minded, how does that differ from contemporary ecological issues and contemporary ways that we're dealing with climate change issues?
For one thing, his concern is not so much about the environment per se as a non-human sphere to be kept pristine for its own sake, but about freedom and nature intertwined in tension within human subjects, and equally under threat from society as a second nature, especially once. So he sees society as man's second nature, and a second nature that, of course, bears upon nature at a certain point, especially since technological society becomes man's primary and nearly exclusive environment. So another aspect of that is that for him, neither nature nor society as a second nature are to be held sacred. Therefore, because being held sacred means justifying sacrifice of the individual and the particular to the whole, whether it's understood as nature or society as fixed permanence, like in traditional societies, or as constant change or progress, like in modern society. So in both cases, the concrete particular and the individual tend to be sacrificed to the whole, and therefore. So his stance is an ethical one to the human and the non-human other by extension. So it differs a lot from a kind of mystical turn to pantheism or to deep ecology, which makes the planet, Gaia, the subject, or animal rights. His approach is unabashedly anthropocentric in as much as it's only humans who can find value in nature. Nothing else in value in nature can see it as nature and value the particulars of it. The cosmos would go back to meaninglessness without humans to wonder at it as a world. And also, yes, there was an awareness. Therefore, if we forget that, if we have uncritical views of science as a kind of magic, being a white magic or a black magic, that things will go astray. Science is neither an oracle nor a demon. But one of his critiques of ecology is they rely too much on science as an authority. That's a critique that he would have, I guess, against. About the discourse of Greta Thunberg, who says just listen to the science. Well, it's not that. It's not the idea of not taking stock of scientific fact, but science should not be a moral authority. It's not no substitute for morals or for politics. So he sees a danger of ecofascism if the need arises for a scientific global management of a beleaguered biosphere. And over against that, he's looking for a higher moral or spiritual authority that can limit and channel science and development with ethical or even sacred boundary markers to protect freedom and nature from operational science and technique, from endless manipulation, even if it's supposed to protect the biosphere or the environment, etc. His beef is with organization as such. It's if we over-organize things, that's what got us into this mess. It is not more technology, more micromanagement of all social issues that are going to get us out of it. We have to get a way find a way for things to be viable and I would hate the word manageable, but I guess livable at a small scale in lived in environments rather than a kind of deified sort of generic environment as such. So it's an awareness of the person in community in the lived environment in the landscape. That's his focus.
So would you consider him a critique of progress?
Certainly, yes. Actually, and but as in as many critiques, he will critique something to defend what's good about it, and he'll be a fierce critique of liberalism because of the inconsistencies and the paradoxes of its defense of freedom. But in the name of freedom, he would critique the liberal tradition. Same thing for progress. And here I could refer to his first public lecture was about in Pau. In southwest France around 1935, but I actually have was called Progress Against Man. He delivered that actually in Bordeaux on January 15th, 1936. He identified Bordeaux as he identified progress as a philosophical ideology common to different. To all of today's political parties, whether communism, liberalism, fascism, they all have the same argument that measurable in dollars or in tons. That is production, and the ideology of production is that of the bourgeois liberalism, which revolutionary ideologies aim to replace. So so revolutionary ideologies of left or right will not change our daily life at that level of because the only efficient revolutions are those that change the way that people live. So then in 1936 he can state that revolution is first of all becoming aware of the reality of the fact and the ideology of progress as the really only central problem of modern civilization. So what might be then so beyond the ideology of progress, what might be a positive critique of that? Well, it's because if quantifiable efficiency is the criterion that then change will be welcome for its own sake. If there are not fixed sort of reference points, then change becomes the new stasis. Everyone has to go with the flow, and because there will always be competitive imperatives or technical constraints that will be invoked to just go with the latest innovation. And that, in a sense, is that for him that is the reactionary position, not to question the change that is dictated by technique. Whereas the truly revolutionary position would be to take a distance from that, and to be able to discern what's worth preserving and the ways in which it can be preserved without by not going along to the way things are going anyway. So So therefore, to him, the progressive stance, as it's usually understood, is a reactionary orientation, and the same old urge to change everything so that nothing does change. So the first thing is to take a difference from the dominant mode of the society, which today is the imperative to change. So, in a sense, he's validating a kind of conservative stance, but against conservatism, which is again in this in the name of preserving this or that fetish of alleged tradition, will justify the actual reckless mobilization and change of the realities on the ground. See, so for instance, nations will mobilize armies and militaries and build atomic weapons while invoking the imaginary of a stable life in the countryside of the homeland, etc. Which, while it's actually destroying the actual countryside with agribusiness, because certain production numbers have to be maintained, etc., for the demands of the economy. So there's an obfuscation in the values that are claimed by ideologies and the realities that they claim, which they destroy. See, so he wants to save the realities over against the ideological transpositions that are instrumentalized for the sake of the increasing buildup of operative potential.
So once you move to that industrialized form of society where you are beholden to quantification as your sort of your grand mover, that's the thing that you're always heading towards in terms of growth and loss and accountancy, and making sure that you always meet that quantity as opposed to a life of quality. I mean, there's lots of literature about this. I wrote an essay on Foucault about the transition from a qualitative to a quantitative society was probably the biggest one of the most important transitions that ever happened. But it seems that Charbonneau is stating that what happens in that shift to quantification is that your very notion of what change is alters into a change of the same. So you just have further industrialization, which is basically the return of the same, because all your acquiring is further quantity. So further industrialization. So this is really a positive feedback loop once it starts. Does Charbonneau believe that a certain form of revolution can break this cycle?
Yes, I mean, it's not to be sort of passively assumed, but he also wrote a whole book called in English Prometheus Rebound, to examine the failure of all revolutions up to now. As I mentioned before, for him, the revolutions that matter are those that begin in one's own life, but not just stay there. You change your own lifestyles and form networks with others who also try to embody their different attitude to life in settings and I was almost going to say institutionalize them, but that's what Ellul was afraid of. But Charbonneau was not, I think, afraid to say that even freedom needs to be institutionalized. It's a paradox, but you can't get around it. You can't just leave it to anarchic spontaneity either. If you for him, it's always a tension to be experienced the freedom is experienced in the resistance of concrete reality. So you find ways for it's. So the outside reality is not just an obstacle; it's what feeds the experience of freedom. Freedom in the sense of a spontaneity out there that you don't have control over. So in a sense, for him, the revolutionary model stems from his own experience of a free yet disciplined life that he experienced as a child among the Scouts. Actually, that there they would have these expeditions in nature and sort of take on the disciplines that would be opposite to certain tasks at hand. They wouldn't just be mechanical, but solutions and leadership would arise in just individuals dealing with the limits of their body and their community within the constraints of nature, which was enjoyed for its own spontaneity. That the great frustration of modern man is being stuck in his second nature. He does not have access to the actual spontaneity of the first nature, and when he thinks of freedom, he thinks of that first nature that of which he is deprived by the second nature of social constraints. So his way of trying to initiate revolution in the 1930s, which he tried to revive down to the 1950s, was to take people away from their usual social settings into nature, with abandoned barns way out in the countryside, and with no facilities, and people would have to light fires and look for wood and cook, and be at once free, because being deciding to be there, and yet experiencing the concrete conditions of what to maintain their freedom, and basically it creates a distance with the second nature of society, but also provides an alternative model. So people wonder, well, why can't we live like that most of the time? So that's the point. Why is this such an exception, so marginal, something so marginal to our lives, rather than being more like rather than the norm? Since this is what we aspire to, and it's when we have leisure, that's what the kind of thing we want to do. And of course, Charbonneau was very critical of mass tourism that tries to regiment even the freedom that people might want to have away from industrial society. Even that is organized. So he was looking for ways to promote experiences of spontaneity from both the subject and from nature, and structures that emerge from that encounter. And for him, the model for that was the European countryside, or actually any kind of countryside, really, as a common work of people and nature, a kind of symbiosis that arises, that is not fusional, that is based on a constant tension. So making that tension conscious in subjects, I guess, would be his revolutionary approach to both, traditional society, insofar as it might still exist, but of course, especially the dominant worldwide industrial society, where any kind of spontaneity, whether human freedom or nature's ways of self-organizing, are pushed to the margins and domesticated and ultimately annihilated and overwritten by technical operational models and mass manipulation. Mm-hmm. So it's really a networking under the radar of things like voting or fomenting coups or takeovers, etc. There might be an actual, if letting an alternative society grow from the grassroots. That's his revolutionary strategy. So there's an element of that in the ecological movement, but he was always critical of the way that Greens try to become part of the established political system. He thought that might be allowed, but as a secondary sphere, the main thing was to develop alternative lifestyles and communities on the ground on a very local basis.
So how did he view the supposed or pseudo freedoms that the industrial society gives us, such as the freedom to watch TV, the freedom to buy all the clothes you want, buy all the knickknacks and gadgets you want, these freedoms which the industrial society promotes as the reason why it's so good? In what sense did he see these freedoms, if they even were freedoms?
Well, for him, they're not freedom because they're all completely pre-formatted. Whatever experience is allowed is framed as choice it's always a kind of it's always a consumer relationship. A kind of active spectator sport in a sense, if I may venture this paradox, to him it's not a question of a certain spectrum of options that are presented through standard platforms, because it's to get out that platform of that platform and experience freely experience your own limits in actual context that are not entirely predetermined by standard delivery systems of experience. So eschewing the commodification and standardization of the range of options. If you have 500 channels on cable, but the experience, it doesn't matter. The content doesn't matter. You're still sitting in front of a screen, and they'll just as is intended by the media industry and the technological society at large. You're not experiencing freedom. You're showing spectacles of freedom, and you accept basically wage slavery and being regulated in every detail of your daily life to buy a certain range of a certain so-called personal selection of those spectacles of freedom or indulgence. So it's the ghost of freedom that gets you more hooked into the system as a delivery system for standard experiences. That gets you to perform for its own increasing penetration of all of life.
So did Charbonneau ever state why he believed so many people were, let's say, taken in by industrialization and simply accepted it? Why is there a herd? Why did the herd simply accept what industrialization gave them? Was it propaganda or was it something else?
His central insight about the nature of freedom is that humans are beings who yearn for freedom but cannot bear it. They love the idea of freedom, but once they're actually free, they can't stand it. So they love to justify a predetermined system with its own logic, saying that it makes them free. See, but and whatever they do for it is in the name of freedom. Especially, of course, in modern societies that are supposedly based on freedom, but everyone likes to think of themselves as free, so they will justify whatever system they're part on as an expression of their core personality. So that's the general truth. And now with technological society, Ellul especially is known for having shown how it's a self-augmenting system that demands ever greater interoperability and therefore has to take over absolutely everything. and it does that, of course, by holding out the mirage that there's a great potential there that is being harnessed, so that there's a kind of investment of freedom in that mirage of having things under control, and therefore theoretically being able to do whatever you want with that freedom. Except, of course, your freedom of action is limited to that apparatus that you're being hooked into. See. So you define your freedom in terms of what the technical system can deliver, and your imaginary is that of technique as the total mobilization of the world's resources. So that's a kind of, well, I'm not sure in so far in what I'm sort of formulating something that's maybe more my take than Charbonneau's. I'm not differing. Don't think you would disagree, but maybe I should go back to so how I got there was to mention that there was the first part of a point is that the technological society has its own momentum, and people are attend because they want to think themselves free. They identify with it, and with that mobilization of potential. So that's one aspect. The propaganda aspect, well, actually, Charbonneau dwelt on that in his in an unpublished book on mediatized society. That could be seen, I suppose, as a counterpart or complement to Ellul's technological society. And here I should get to my notes on that. Yes, in that book he writes that the media generate a philosophy and a society that identify with the instant as religions and societies of the past did with an illusory eternity, well, even as they change imperceptibly, whereas today mediatized information prevents man from fulfilling his calling to maintain permanence within movement, to go further without losing his way, in other words, to progress, thus undermining any effort, whether conservative or revolutionary at social transformation. So again, the urge to change and to follow the channels of change that are self-generating through technique obscures whatever values one might want to live out in one's life, including with the aspiration to change society. In so far as one invests in technical means, one will be reshaped by them, and it's technique that's going to have the last word. Whatever the discourse that's being spread, well, we see this today. People are sort of fed up and protesting with the society they're in, and they claim to reject the system, etc., or even Silicon Valley, but. What is the medium of that? Well, social media. See, they hooked even more intimately into the very system that they claim to reject, because their outlet for that is formatted by information delivery systems, and of which they're just raw material. It's a process of turning everything into raw material or as data that Charbonneau saw arising, through industrial society, but coming to the fore quite clearly with the Great War, with the First World War. And sees 20th century revolutions as part of that World War phenomenon, which is not a war that happened to. Wars that happen to exist on a world scale, but the very process of revolutionizing the world, that is the war, and that is the revolution of the 20th century. This mobilization of everything, that is what was at stake. Mobilization of hearts and minds, as one for whatever purpose. It did not matter. I mean, after all, it's the Americans who launched the atomic bomb, and not the Nazis or the Japanese. And it doesn't matter if you claim moral values or etc. you're part of that system, and even pretending to fighting it with the same weapons turns you into that system. Yeah.
One of the things you said that's really interesting to me, and is a big personal interest of mine. This idea of transforming things into matter, into material. This sort of move towards a productive society where everything is production, and in the sense that man becomes entirely subsumed into that industrialized society of quantifiable units of data or whatever. Man is just this productive unit. And Charbonneau, in the PDFs you sent me and the pieces I read, he was really critical of the healthcare system. I guess it's primarily the Western healthcare system. And this idea that, you become material is that suffering and agony is prolonged because you are seen as this sort of lump of material that just should be kept alive as a productive unit. So what was Charbonneau's relationship with death and suffering in relation to his theories on industrial society?
Well, there's actually a whole chapter on the topic in his book, I Was, an Essay on Freedom, that was mostly written by 1954. And I'll venture to give you the gist of it. I had certain excerpts that I've translated. So he would say that Charbonneau would say that mortality is inherent to individuality, and there is no freedom without facing it. But after a last spurt of death consciousness with the Romantic period, death became a stranger in liberal societies. Our systems ignore it, and our life is built on so-called positive activities that lack a foundation. So when death strikes, we are taken aback and we don't know how to handle it. Then the liberal world had emancipated the individual, ever so little, but already too much. For without serious Christian faith, liberal man had become incapable of bearing his death, and with it freedom itself. The 19th century, as the century of freedom, was thus unwittingly bearing the power that would destroy freedom along with its contradictions, the worship of the material fact, of what is useful. And justified by the supreme authority of utilitarian facts, man could become fully absorbed in the organization of the world. Action upon things fed off the spiritual force previously spent on creating gods. So having become an end in itself, practical activity borrowed the efficacy of faith, now invested in the mastery of nature and even of human nature and the conquest of the future. Pragmatic frenzy tended to totalitarian organization, so that born of freedom, the denial of death led to the destruction of freedom. And not just through the cult of state power. The passion for money, for economic enterprise actually serves a will to power that is the result of our powerlessness before death. So that's partly what drives industrialization, as to refer to your previous question. So the spontaneous reaction of members of individualistic, non-religious societies is to flee from their death by living in the moment. And this goes for Christians as well as people of their time. With a vague sense of freedom and yet incapable of accepting death as its corollary, the individual loses himself in pleasure, which is however fleeting and reminiscent as such of individual mortality. So to come to the gist of your question, so when quality of life goes below a certain pleasure quota, life becomes pointless. There just comes a point when fighting against mortality is no longer enough. The locus of its awareness must be rooted out. When the moment of death could decide the meaning of life in a Christian regime, dying unconscious in one's sleep was not a fate to be envied as it is now. In our advanced societies, increased life expectancy comes along with a demand for euthanasia. The disappearance of the taboo about the creation and destruction of life is a slippery slope to the perfect tyranny of perfect freedom from nature and truth. For if each individual can theoretically kill off another for honorable or rational motives, social order and economic progress may soon justify on the collective plane a natural measure that love of neighbor had exceptionally justified for an individual. So, of course, euthanasia and the rest as a slippery slope. Now, on the way there, medical progress prolongs agony indefinitely. And the decision to stop the final torture that life becomes, along with the machine that maintains it, will fall more and more to medical professionals. To Bernard Charbonneau, this is a good example of the surprising problems that technical advancement can bring. Old age itself becomes an issue that is best avoided in its implication of a slow, messy, disgusting passing from life. For the tranquility of the living, at least, Charbonneau points out, old people must disappear into some house of agony, or else they must be killed before it is too late. An injection is so much neater than the absurd struggles of so-called natural death. In nature, death is the price of life, but this soothing formula is cold comfort to humans when death comes. And in a passage of that book on freedom added in 1975, Charbonneau speculates that as there are maternities today, there will be mortuaries where specialists will deal out a painless death, sort of like in the movie Soylent Green, while columbariums will be replaced by video archives, allowing the dear departed's lives to be played, to play again forever in 3D at the touch of a button, kind of constant celebration of life, that can be replayed at will by the survivors. This is not far from the transhumanist dream of uploading the memories of loved ones along with one's own. The existential import of these ever-expanding forms of denial of death is not the fear of a death so easily denied, so much as the anxiety of having to go through a new birth through one's own most personal life that only comes into focus at the sight of the gallows. Only a human person can die. Its spiritual truth is born of its physical reality as something irreducibly given. Awareness of death reveals to us the mystery of our life, that of an absolute spirit embodied in a finite existence, totally partaking of finitude and totally transcending it. That's the nature of spirit. And death and the questions it raises are the last religious experience left to us moderns. The final presence of God is his absence at this supreme moment. And if someday human freedom managed to defeat its old enemy by eliminating death as the contradiction that forces every human being to challenge the universe, it would only destroy itself. The price of transhumanist immortality is loss of individuality and therefore of the meaning and value of life. To me, that's for instance, I'm finishing an article on the movie Annihilation, and I see it as among other things, a meditation on denial of death as the transhuman dream, that our society promotes, and of course, and the trade-off between immortality and individuality, and that. And it's kind of pathetic, of course, how literal that's that plays out in transhumanist fantasies, well, down the street from me there's the office of an online radio company called Sirius, and I think the big boss has expressed the hope of building a perfect replica of her partner to have her around after she dies. It's those kind of things. Of course, the transhumanists themselves hope to just out cheat. The whole idea of transhumanism is to transcend death altogether. But of course, if you don't face with your own finitude, well, you're more. Even if you can pretend you succeed for a while, it's probably to become a monster. Without a sense of finiteness, there's no ethics and really no meaning, just an indefinite expansion, just like technique is. It's like that. It's becoming the kind of organism that worldwide technique already is. It's kind of a perverted idea of freedom as the self-perpetuating extension of a theoretical range of options, which always boil down to the same thing: perpetuating potential as potential, the means as an end. And that there's a feedback between technology and individual psychology at that level.
Was Charbonneau religious?
Unlike Ellul, he was an agnostic, but deeply informed by the implications of Christian faith, of its ethical implication, especially by the core tenet of incarnation, which he took very seriously. A spirit needs to be embodied in a finite mortal being, and the modern temptation is to forego that. And without finiteness, being one particular person that will not live forever, it cannot expand indefinitely, facing your own mortality, that's where only there can you find a transcendent meaning, not in the security of something objectively out there that outlives you so much as just facing that tension yourself. Even like Christ on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? If you can experience that's where its spirit is embodied. Of course, he did not believe in the dogmatic content of Christianity in the sense of the resurrection and all that, but the ethical implications were central to him, and he tried to live them out in a sense coherently, and being very hard on Christians for most often failing to do that. So it was a very interesting tension between him and Ellul on that count. Ellul being an early convert to Protestant Christianity, and a very prominent theologian, but a very demanding existential one, like on the model of Kierkegaard. It was a kind of intense tension, dialectic between them, very nourishing for both, but centered on the idea of incarnation, that the spirit transcends life, yet it can only be experienced in life as something finite, and that faces annihilation.
Yeah. Okay. Understood. So, in that sense of being a finite being and being an individual, because you mentioned at the start that Charbonneau it took you a while to find him because he was out in rural France, I believe. Was solitude and introversion, were these important factors in his understanding of how one should direct themselves in relation to modern society?
Well, absolutely, and then there was always there are two tension between the demand for solitude and the need for authentic human interaction. That's what drove his life. For instance, I found notes that he wrote when David Reedsman's book The Lonely Crowd came out, about how actually mass society promotes loneliness, which is not solitude, of course. A crowd of people who think themselves free, but they're actually other-directed and longing for more authentic freedom. And of course, he wanted to go the opposite route and get people out of that lonely crowd, out into nature, facing their finitude, discovering that they share it with other people, sharing that experience of individual finitude authentically with with fellow beings, and creating a society on the basis of that shared experience of individual authenticity in common. it's what humans have in common is their finite individuality, and it was his wager to found a society on that, which is for him that would have been on freedom rooted in nature. So that was, of course, his strategy of having reflection camps in the countryside for to promote that experience, and hoping that people would try to find ways in their daily lives to live closer to that. And that informed, of course, his attitude to nature, because there was an appendix to his 1937 essay manifesto on feeling for nature as a revolutionary force, where that was kind of that listed the regulations of what might be a federation of friends of nature. And there's a passage where about solitude. He says the true friend of nature flees the city to escape the artificial life that he leads there. He comes back to nature to find again his condition as a human, to run risks, to be hungry and thirsty, to be sated. He knows that there only he will find the sincerity and the freedom that he has lost. See? And I think this is something that resonates, of course, with other ecologists like Aldo Leopold, who also was critical of tourism, in that he said that Leopold said that mass use involves a direct dilution of the opportunity for solitude. So not making things easy for people when they go out to encounter nature. Now, now, as for perhaps the more explicitly spiritual side of solitude, so Charbonneau was meant to create a true society based on solitude, a community of action based on the desire to maintain the possibilities of inner life against a world that denies them. You know, it's very close to what. One of the few writers who had similar concerns at the time, the Catholic novelist and essayist Georges Bernanos, said that we cannot understand modern society unless we realize that it's a counter civilization as a universal conspiracy against any kind of inner life. You know? And Charbonneau and Ellul were aware of him, and they were on the same page with regard to that. That statement in Bernanos' book, France Against the Robots. As Charbonneau put it, only a community of solitary people who have not abolished but continued the road of their own solitude can accomplish this solitude in a community. So there's a deep link between solitude and solidarity, as you also find, I guess, is in Albert Camus. Yeah. So it's part of that existential nexus of thinkers for whom deep awareness of finite individuality is precisely what founds social commitment. Yeah.
Speaking of individuality, I do want to ask, I can think, because I get the impression that Charbonneau is quite a practical thinker at times, especially in relation to what one should do. And what do you think Charbonneau would say to people now who would like to find more freedom in industrial society? Do you think he would give them some advice?
Well, in all his books, he always ends up by giving a few ideas of practical things that might be done by individuals or groups of people, etc., to promote the experience of freedom that he tries to outline. So you're asking me to speculate about what he might say now?
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Well, he might say, well, get away from the screen as soon as you're finished this conversation. Leave it off, for a week or so. Think about this conversation you just had. Walk out into a park or into the country. Let it sink in. Talk about it with other people. Not compare notes on the latest social media sensation, but know what is the experience you're having in common, and how does that resonate with certain thoughts that you had in that recent conversation. It's that practical. As long as we're stuck to our screen, thinking about how we might get away from them, there's a problem. But of course, I'm the first to do that. I never get away from my screen. We're all part of that vortex. But he would point to. He would be the first to point to these kinds of contradictions. Having said that, of course, I mean he read the newspaper Le Monde every day, but with a critical eye, to try to unpack all the unsaid and the contradictions, and to see it as a kind of artifact, a piece of evidence of the social machinery, of the construction of discourse as an integral part of that mobilization of conscience along with matter, and that was always one of his primary strategies. Even in the 1930s, he had press clubs to get people to analyze the kind of news, even seemingly silly news that you would get at the time through illustrated magazine, gossip columns, etc., to deconstruct that also. See. So, I mean, with a Charbonnist approach today, you would have a field day just analyzing and deconstructing your Google feed of the latest, celebrity sensations and cancel culture scandals and Twitter storms, etc., to deconstruct how that works, and yet somehow to keep that. To have enough filters to keep it to certain limited areas and times of your life. To have a life outside of that, rather than being just sucked in by that. See, that's the balancing act that is deliberately being made more and more difficult and well nigh impossible today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is there anything you would like to add? Obviously, we could talk for ages about Charbonneau and philosophy and industrial society, but is there anything key or specific that you'd like to add in that you feel should be added in on a conversation about Charbonneau? Well,
yeah, I had a bit of a regret in the interview that where you found me, that I didn't answer as clearly as I would have hoped to what I think is the central point of Charbonneau's analysis, which is the dialectic of system and chaos, mm-hmm. that both grow side by side in modern society, and they feed on each other. And actually did prepare a few passages on that. Just give me the time to. Yes, and we also didn't get to talk about the idea of the Great Malting. That's another central issue, central point of his originality. So we'll have to decide what I talk about. But I first have to find my materials. Actually, there's two ideas. We should talk a little about the idea of the Great Malting, mm-hmm. And then about the dialectics of system and chaos.
Okay.
So I have a few pages on that, and I think it will be worthwhile. You even had a question. You might want to ask it yourself.
Yeah. So the Great Malting is the idea that comes up in the Green Light. So the idea is of this thing that you were speaking about earlier, of the two natures. The first nature, as we commonly understand nature, greenery, etc., trees, and the second nature created by man of society. So this idea of the Great Malting is in relation to the way in which we create this nature and the way we create the second nature and the way in which it overtakes the first nature, correct?
Yeah. So, yes, if I may develop that, yes, society for Charbonneau arose as a cohesive set of cultural and material extensions of man, as McLuhan would say, to create a safe distance from the pressures of nature in a distinct space of relative freedom from nature. However, this comes at a price, paid in new social determinations as civilization progresses with increasing social pressures of its own. This social determinism becomes overwhelming with industrial society that tips the scales for good against nature's resilience and becomes an autonomous, all-encompassing, ever-expanding environment of its own. So initially man-made, this second nature is increasingly alien and alienating to man as a creature of flesh and spirit, which it turns willy-nilly into a cogwheel or circuit within its own machinery of social organization. This stage is one in which humanity is shedding nature as its environment, as a snake sheds its skin, to become encased in a second nature of its own making, hence the term the Great Malting. This mutation cannot be compared with previous major social transformations, such as the reformations brought about by revolutions in which collective behavior was reorganized by new meanings and values. It is more like a biological mutation, or rather like a geological phenomenon such as a huge landslide or avalanche, a powerful, all-encompassing, and controlled neither by thought nor by any human intention. Under such circumstances, in contrast to humanistic assumptions about individuality, the so-called inner self spontaneously conforms to anonymous social trends. So the Great Malting, in a sense, is through which our species is shedding its old Neolithic skin as two main characteristics. First was revealed by the Great War, World War I, as a total war which introduced a complete subordination of reality to the logic of technological and industrial imperatives. This logic requires the mobilization of the whole population, of all resources, industry, agriculture, forests, and therefore of all space. The war also achieved the mobilization of the inner life of people. Whichever the side in the conflict, not only were vast populations directed by the war, but people were also drawn into collective consent to it as a matter of course, just justifying the anonymous process that was destroying them as individuals. The Great War was the first experience of what Charbonneau terms a total social phenomenon. He insists that such a phenomenon does not have to be totalitarian in order to be total. It's just the working out of what was actually developed in liberal capitalist societies. And it may not be the most efficient way for it to develop. It probably developed much better in so-called liberal societies. Better, of course, in its own terms of self-expansion. Now, second aspect of the Great Malting is that it is characterized by self-acceleration. Since the Great War, human power has been taking hold of the entire planet at an ever-increasing pace. Charbonneau argues that this acceleration is a quasi-autonomous process. It is not directed by a collective project, and most of its effects have not been chosen, and there is no pilot. It simply rushes forward. So change happens, period. So Charbonneau, therefore, with the Great Malting, has in mind something very much like the Great Acceleration described by one of the originators of the notion of an Anthropocene era, characterized, aside from the impact of fossil fuels, by, I quote Stephen Crutzen and McNeil there in their 2007 article, the Anthropocene era characterized by a major transition whereby the characteristic habitat of the human species, which for several millennia had been the village, now was becoming the city. So Charbonneau came to the same realization from his own everyday experience at an early age in Bordeaux, where he was born in 1910, dying in 1996. So 1910, for these authors, originators of the Anthropocene concept, is the date of the beginning of the incubation period of stage 2 of the Great Acceleration that officially started for them in 1945. And Charbonneau described it in those terms already that very year in 1945 in a public lecture entitled "The Year 2000." Putting Hiroshima in that wider context, where peaceful growth would do more irreversible damage to natural and cultural formations than war ever did. So in France, what followed were the so-called 30 glorious years of accelerated modernization, when Bernard Charbonneau was among the sole dissenting voices, unheard until the 1968 generation discovered the environment as an issue in its turn. So the intervening wasteland years from 1945 to 1970, at least, of preaching in the desert. He lived in solitude, save for having Jacques Ellul as a dialogue partner, who gave him a break with some publications to Protestant or academic conditions whenever he could, and of course with having his wife as his Henriette as his alter ego. So one man against this massive onslaught of basically the Anthropocene. That's what he's talking about, something completely overwhelming and that is a consequence of human freedom, but that moves without human agency,
Mm-hmm.
And we still like to project, our ideas of freedom and agency onto it. But it's, he was a geographer, so very, very alert. Not just to the particular of landscape, but to the vast inhuman forces that shaped it. And he recognized that man had become one of those inhuman forces. That's his great insight with the Great Malting. And what does freedom mean when faced with that? That the same being who can experience freedom is also in a collective and also in the greatest threat against the possibility of humanity, and that power is not just an objective physical overwhelming physical and overwhelming power out there, but its wellspring is actually the way that a very human subject tends to justify it or some aspect of it.
And
so
in what way is that in relation to this dialectic of disorder and chaos and
system and chaos?
System and chaos.
System, chaos, and I think it feeds into it. And for him, a good example of it would be car culture, of which he was an early critic, writing one of his early books on that in 1965 called L'homme moto, as a single word, as a kind of to describe a hybrid being that is no longer quite man and is not just machine. As the true subject of modernity, the car driver. So actually, if I may start by describing his approach to car culture, and then go on to broader considerations about how that plays out. This is the dialectic of system and chaos. So by invoking necessity to plan the pursuit of freedom through the industrial gauntlet, and especially the automotive gauntlet, sexing it up as the sole escape from its own pressures, that's how it works. People have projected their sense of freedom in their car. So that I just read today that it came out also in news recently well, of course, the 1% of the richest people in the population give out as much climate changing gases as the poorest half, and part of that is driven by and among that that has a lot to do with the spread of the SUVs, as the second largest contributor to climate change. Imagine that, something that's has no function. There's no reason for that except as a kind of symbol of freedom, of making it, of identifying with the technical system, so you can defy it with the possibility of the idea that you could go off the road. Whereas, of course, what it entices you to is to live for the road.
Mm-hmm.
That's how it works. Cars like that, with their prestige, embody a sense of power that defies the gridlock and embodies a dream of leaving the beaten track that is paved with planners' designs to channel and spread it ever further afield, as an end in itself. As a teenager already, Bernard Charbonneau came to think it no coincidence that mechanized warfare's imperious demands instantly remade in its image every nation alike, just at the moment when automobile traffic was replacing shared living space as the city's organizing principle. He found it highly suspect and significant that all of a sudden, overnight, children and cats would disappear from the street, and they would just be become car delivery systems. The urban street was becoming that, and no one was thinking about the implications of that. The cities becoming transit networks for cars instead of a human habitat. Also an habitat also for animals at that point. Mm-hmm. For Charbonneau, cars were but one everyday manifestation of the vast, unquestioned network of technical infrastructure taking over all aspects of life in a global society where nature and freedom were together pushed to the margins. And to him, that meant that as a child, you could just go down the street and the wilderness already began. You just wander freely through the trees and the dunes and what have you. And year by year, the urban sprawl consumed that and pushed that miles and miles and miles away. A direct experience of nature, which was within reach of most urban dwellers, until a century or so ago, became relegated to something you would see in movies, or dream about. And that was a direct result of the organization of transportation and communication for more efficiency. So, if I may, I translated some pithy passages of Charbonneau's book on cars, L'Homme Auto from 1965, and I think it may encapsulate this logic and make it alive, and then I'll try to develop it more theoretically. So he writes there in 65 that the car is both conservative and revolutionary, but in a bad way. It imports capitalism wherever it appears, and yet the America it shapes is as a world closer to Lenin than to Jefferson by the total organization it dictates, by the spread of highways everywhere that turn any place near a highway becomes centered on that highway, and any kind of local self-sufficiency or particularity is sort of sucked up by the need to service what goes through the highway. So the car is movement and thus progress, but the graphic curve of progress is not linear but exponential, he writes in 65. Almost bow to the automobile fate that demands more and more cars, 3 times more when the population doubles, as was forecast for Paris in the year 2000. To avoid or defer an apocalypse of sprawl and gridlock, we have to accept a technocratic dictatorship. Society and the human individual being totally alienated to the car, highway planning will prevail without resistance, and if bulldozers are not enough, psychology and sociology, rather than humanize the car, will automobilize man. The state becomes a permanent education to traffic as real citizens' prime environment, from the dinky toys they play with from infancy to the hearse that retires them to the junkyard. The new Adam of the automotive Jerusalem is not trained for the freedom promised in car ads, but for obedience to traffic rules, and better yet, to instant reflexes. Since the proliferation of cars must be matched by that of laws, the automobile regime is not liberal, but a police state. The automobile people knows that the police is its ally. It respects the police in order to give itself the illusion of freely yielding to its discretionary calls. Highway patrolmen are the knights errant of the road in their spaceman outfits, embodying an automotive mystique, so that the penances they give to sinners who contravene against the highway code are received with respect and deference, or else. The highway police heralds a society ruled by police authority more than power. The car doesn't care for freedom. The greater its speed, the less room there is for choice to avoid accidents. The driver's dutiful respect and conscious discipline are not enough. Automatic reactions are preferable to human awareness, feeding the dream of self-driving automated cars, which Charbonneau foresaw in 1965 in the following terms. Maybe one day, he muses, in lieu of a driver, the car will be equipped with a kind of electronic robot permanently informed by a cybernetic machine holding all traffic data. The automobile apocalypse would be avoided. A brave new world could spin ever faster in circles without moving. The revolution will have been achieved once society as a whole has become an automated mobile, so the police and the state could wither. Freedom would at last reign on earth. He's being, of course, very ironic and very sarcastic. So car culture is a perfect example of what makes Charbonneau define man as a being who craves freedom but cannot stand it. Mm-hmm. Now, liberal man in particular, who defines himself by his freedom, is all the more ready to submit to social control in every detail of his life if it is under the guise of freedom. The car and the attendant social system perfectly encapsulates this paradox that technology drives into deeper and deeper recesses of our very being, in the name of a power of choice that cannot help playing by the strict rules of unprecedented levels of control. In the fine details of our lives. So the way this plays out on a wider societal level is the dialectics of system and chaos, which Charbonneau summed up in 2 axioms in a book written in the early 60s at the same time as Le Motto, but first published in 1973 thanks to the intercession of his friend and neighbor Henri Lefebvre, the Marxist author of The Right to the City. Mm-hmm. Urban issues are constant here. So he starts from the axiom, that slowly made its way through the more radical currents of political ecology, such as degrowth, that indefinite development in finite space-time is an impossibility. Mm-hmm. He writes that in the late 60s. Exponential development, therefore, leads to chaos. So the more power is involved, the stricter order must be, as we've seen with cars. Exponential development, as he calls it, demands total organization of social, collective, and personal life, tending to some form of totalitarianism. The tendency to chaos and the drive to make a system feed on each other and reinforce each other. So thus, facing the risk of environmental and social chaos that goes along with unhindered development, our societies only know one way to answer, with more science and technique to better organize society and control individuals. The spread of organizations makes local societies unable to organize themselves, and therefore becoming disorganized and therefore chaotic. You don't therefore need more system to manage them. See, it's when a society can no longer police themselves just by the ordinary, civility of a community that holds together and people care to each other. So it's there that you have the idea of police as an institution to go on top and monitor it. Mm-hmm. But that's just the guy with the stick who ensures there's no violence. But everything is like that. The more you undo local custom, the more you have to regulate from above through the state, through standard procedures that are enforced by corporations, etc. But such this larger system that arises on national and on international stage is prone to accident because it's so the very material base of a society of finite beings still dependent on nature is made more fragile. So it needs greater control to even hold in place. And that itself promotes the growth of system and control, generating more disorganization of any kind of local stable conditions. So, and of course, being ever more accident prone because of the increasing complexity that's vulnerable to any kind of glitch. So high-tech systems are prone to terrible accidents if they meet with the slightest deviation from their norms, from manufacturing defects, unforeseen circumstances of human error. They must therefore invest in more research and development to curtail in advance any such hindrances to the smooth operation of their regular procedures by integrating and subduing outside factors. They thus develop more far-reaching technical extensions that entail more disruptive interactions with an environment not yet fully under control, so that new social and environmental regulations must be enforced to make the world more predictable and safer for technological operation. But there is always more outside world and more unforeseen circumstance than any science can control in advance, so that technology must keep advancing onto new territory to secure present and future control and safety. As the vice of social organization gets tighter, the margin of freedom is reduced along with the room for error. As the risks and consequences of the slightest disorganization become more serious at every turn. So as the horizon of this vicious cycle, Charbonneau sees all techniques converging under an overarching organization technique that keeps track of all particular organization, like a totalitarian state. It might just as well be, I guess, from our 21st century experience, sort of worldwide media corporation. I think they're more powerful and threatening and more universal than any state today. So at the same time, in his last book called Finistère, End, that he wrote around 1990, Charbonneau sees a deadly contradiction at work between the unification of the world by science and its division by nationalisms, in competition for the same prize of total control held out by technique, as it has them all play by its own set of rules, even against dominant agents, dominant states. This common power logic of state and science leaves the modern world in the horns of a final dilemma between chaos or total order, the destruction of mankind or world empire, or in other words, literal death or living death, fate worse than death, which is the disappearance of freedom as a lived reality. Mm-hmm. So to Charbonneau, this means that if man, to escape the flames of an atomic accident or indeed an environmental disaster, had to bury himself alive in a total organization, then the end of the world might be a grace or relief. Anticipating the kind of trade-off between the collective good of bare life and safety for all and drastically curtailed personal freedoms, which all governments have imposed amidst the current global health emergency, as an effect, which the COVID issue as an effect of environmental stress in the first place. Charbonneau speculates that what awaits us, as during the last total war, is probably a mixture of technocratic organization and return to the Stone Age. So both system and chaos. We are going to have the Merovingian period, the early Middle Ages, the so-called Dark Ages. We are going to have the Merovingian period managed by electronics. Scarcity, violence, and terrors that can only be made bearable by the power and sacred authority that will save the planet or finish it off. To get past this dilemma of total system and or total chaos, Bernard Charbonneau sees only one way: rebuilding society on new basis as individuals united in the conviction that freedom is not found in increasing power, but in a daily concrete ability to act personally within meaningful local communities. Such was his lifelong revolutionary project, and one which he tried to inspire people to start, within their own daily immediate circumstances. Doesn't go top down, but really from the grassroots. And it's something that, in an article I've pointed out communalities between that and the transition towns movement of Rob Hopkins. Just identifying the resources for local life that you have around you and in your community, and see how that might survive a collapse of the system, or even begin to live healthy, fruitful, and free lives without it, so that gets to survive, and not just the horror, the chaos, and the tyrannies that are in store for us. So I like to compare that, to our mammal ancestors, the marsupial rats who ran between the legs of the dinosaurs, and would hardly have been detected by alien visitors until, there was an accident of sudden climate change, and the dinosaurs disappears, and guess what? It's the little rats that no one would have noticed who ended up occupying all the ecological niches. Mm-hmm. So it's an image I've come up to try to capture the kind of strategy Charbonneau, like Ellul, had in mind. Starting a different way of living in your life, and with others like-minded people, or try to draw neighbors into it, so that your actual community, has a certain quality of life, not defined in quantitative terms, and one that has a certain resilience to preserve human meaning and flourishing beyond the development and eventual collapse of a chaotic system.
I think that image of the dinosaurs of modernity being destroyed by this metaphorical meteor or ice age, where the chaos finally overcomes it, and the rats who are scurrying and being ignored and silent and slowly building their lives. I think that's a good image to finish on. I think we've done a good job.
Yes.
It seems. So unless there's anything else you'd like to add, Christian, thanks very much.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to bring Charbonneau's message to out of clandestinity to a wider audience where it might resonate.